America today feels similar to the early 2000s after 9/11, a moment when escalation in the Middle East nearly pushed the U.S. into a new chapter of its history. Add China, which has intensified trade wars. Add Russia, still tied down in Ukraine under heavy sanctions. Yet the most heated and unstable situation right now is Iran. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. appeared to move into a new phase. In 2025, U.S. forces carried out strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. What you see here are images of those bombed nuclear sites. Earlier in 2022, Iran's leader, Khamenei, authorized the supply of military equipment to Russia, triggering additional economic sanctions. That decision deepened Iran's internal crisis and made human rights violations inside the country appear even more severe than before. This makes us curious. Could this moment lead to a repeat of the early 2000s, when policy missteps created instability that followed U.S. citizens for the next decade? Before we dig deeper, we first need to understand Iran and U.S. relations. Iran is a Middle Eastern nation with a theocratic authoritarian government and vast oil resources. This combination has produced one of the most socially restrictive systems in the world, from clothing rules and gender laws to limits on education and public life. Yet this was not always the case. Before modern times, especially before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran was a secular and relatively open society. Western education was common. Nightclubs existed in major cities. Western clothing and cultural openness were normal. This secular direction began under the Pahlavi dynasty. In 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi took power and aggressively separated religion from the state. He banned the hijab, reduced the influence of Shia clergy, and pushed Iran toward Western-style modernization. But this secularization was not just cultural, it was political. It was designed to prevent religious authorities from gaining power over the state. That balance shifted during World War II. Although Iran declared neutrality, the Shah's government was perceived as leaning toward Germany. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran to secure supply routes and oil access. Reza Shah was forced into exile. So Iran entered the war years with a massive power vacuum. The monarchy remained, but real authority shifted toward parliamentary democracy. Between 1941 and the late 1940s, Iran functioned largely as a constitutional system, where prime ministers held real power, while the Shah remained weak. After World War II, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi returned. Yet the balance of power still favored parliament. That changed in 1951. Parliament elected Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister, a nationalist leader, promising economic independence and democratic reform. He moved to reduce royal authority and prevent the monarchy from re-centralizing power. But global politics were also shifting. By this point, the United States and the United Kingdom were locked into Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. Mossadegh's most consequential move was the nationalization of Iran's oil industry, including assets controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. So Iran's domestic reform became an international crisis. Oil nationalization directly threatened Western economic and strategic interests. In response, the UK and US supported pro-monarchy politicians, media campaigns, and military figures inside Iran. Yet despite nationalizing key industries, Mossadegh's government was increasingly portrayed as unstable and corrupt. That tension peaked in 1953. But this was not a spontaneous collapse. With covert US and British support, Mossadegh was overthrown, and power was fully centralized under the Shah. So the monarchy returned, stronger, more centralized, and less accountable than before. Oil control was partially restructured under Western-aligned frameworks, while political opposition was crushed. The Shah's post-1953 government remained secular, but increasingly authoritarian and corrupt. Wealth concentrated among elites, repression intensified, and public resentment grew. By the 1970s, global pressure increased. The 1973 Yom Kippur War triggered an oil shock that destabilized the global economy. Iran, deeply tied to Western industrial systems, was heavily affected. So economic strain combined with political repression. Discontent spread across society, eventually mobilized by Shia clergy, revolutionary groups, and parts of the military. In 1979, the Shah fled Iran. But this time, there was no return. The secular monarchy collapsed, and power shifted to a theocratic system under Ruhollah Khomeini and the Shia clergy. So the new Islamic Republic was built on historical trauma. From its perspective, trusting Western powers had repeatedly led to exploitation and instability. Yet instead of selective reform, the response was total rejection. Strict clothing laws, gender restrictions, and limits on education, especially for women, were framed as defenses against Western values rather than internal repression. So we understand Iran's past and how it shaped the present. But if this tension has existed for decades, why does Western pressure suddenly feel urgent again? Look at this. These were Iran's nuclear facilities before the US strikes. But how did Iran even obtain nuclear knowledge in the first place? After the 1979 revolution, Iran claimed it had finally achieved true independence from Western influence, marked by the Shah fleeing the country. The nation was now led by Khomeini, and Iran shifted toward radicalism, while facing growing pressure from the United States. Yet the revolution itself was not the direct cause of US sanctions. The real turning point came when Iranian student groups seized the US embassy in Tehran, taking around 66 American hostages. When Khomeini learned of the takeover, he did not condemn it. Instead, he endorsed the action, framing it as a symbol of resistance against imperialism. This hostage crisis lasted from 1979 to 1981. During negotiations, the United States temporarily lifted certain sanctions in exchange for the hostages' release. That moment was widely seen as a failure in how the U.S. handled the crisis. But the easing was short-lived. By 1984, the United States officially designated Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, placing the country under broader and more permanent sanctions. As a result, Iran became more isolated than ever. Before the revolution, Iran had already begun developing advanced industries, including nuclear education and early infrastructure, largely with Western support. But after sanctions, much of this technological cooperation stalled. So we understand how Iran became sanctioned. But the real question is, how did Iran remain a threat despite decades of isolation? After Western sanctions, Iran did not surrender. Instead, it adapted. Oil became the backbone of survival. Iran sold much of its oil to rivals of the United States, not allies, but partners of convenience. These relationships were not ideological. They were based on survival. Iran cooperated with the Soviet Union and later Russia, China, and North Korea, particularly on missile development. But missiles were not the only focus. Oil revenue was reinvested into domestic industry, including nuclear facilities developed under United Nations civilian provisions. From Iran's perspective, this was legal nuclear development. But from the U.S. perspective, nuclear knowledge itself became the threat. Because knowledge can always be converted into weapons capability. This concern eventually crossed a new threshold. In 2025, the United States carried out direct military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, including sites linked to enrichment and nuclear research. These strikes marked the first open U.S. bombing of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, aimed at slowing Tehran's nuclear progress. Iran claimed the damage was limited. The U.S. claimed the strikes were effective. But strategically, the result was clear. The rivalry had entered a new phase. Escalation did not begin in 2025. As early as 2022, Iran supplied drones to Russia during the Ukraine war, triggering additional U.S. sanctions. Yet even that pressure failed to halt Iran's momentum. As the war continued, Iran increased oil exports to China, helping fuel Chinese industry and securing steady revenue. This further alarmed Washington. Iran was projecting power abroad, while many of its internal economic problems remained unresolved. Under the Trump administration, Iran once again became both a new and old rival. So the final question remains, could this trajectory lead to another escalation? Similar to the early 2000s, where military intervention is framed as the only way to stop the threat?